Hello, everybody. It is my pleasure to welcome Maya Wiley tonight. I think we're all excited to hear from her. I have an added bonus that Maya and I went to law school together in a year. I'm not going to mention how long ago, but we did, in fact, graduate the same year. Since then, Maya has had a very successful career in the nonprofit sector and government. She began her career at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, the American Civil Liberties Union, and Open Society Institute. I'm sorry, I'm an environmental lawyer. I always think Open Space Institute. Open Society Institute. In 2002, Maya founded and became president of the Center for Social Inclusion, which is a national policy strategy organization dedicated to dismantling systemic racism. In 2014, Wiley was appointed as counsel to Mayor de Blasio, a big job. And in this role, she worked on civil rights and immigrants' rights issues, among other things. And then after leaving City Hall in 2016, Maya was appointed as the chair of the New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board and co-chair of the City Diversity Task Force, while also serving as senior vice president for social justice at the New School. She later became a professor at the university and founded its Digital Equity Laboratory to identify and address injustices that persist and evolve as technology modifies our world. Maya received her bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College and her law degree from Columbia University. So without taking up any more time, I will turn it over to our guest, Maya Wiley. Welcome, Maya.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure and added bonus to get to see you, but also thank you, Julie, and thank you all for inviting me and for making time, and for some folks that I've long known and respected, like Peggy Shepard. Thank you. Listen, I'm running to be the next mayor of New York City for one very simple reason, and it's that I believe and know from my time in city government that we can be a city we can all live in with dignity. And dignity means many things, and I'm not going to go through everything it means, but you know, as you all well know, it means development without displacement. It means having an education system that has high expectation for all our children. It means putting the public back in public safety, and it also means jobs with a future and a climate that doesn't kill us. And it means many, many more things, but those are all core. And there are core challenges that we have to meet, and we have to meet in a more partnered way that also understands that there's not always a one-size-fits-all one neighborhood to another. And just to share a little bit of my personal experience that frames why that is calling me into this race now, but also why I have the history and background that you heard Steve summarize, which I won't talk a lot about right now, is that I spent my early years in a Black segregated neighborhood in DC, you know, with, frankly, running the back alleys with my friends, because that's where we played. You know why we played there? Because there was no playground. There was DuPont Circle, which did have grass, but it was also not a very welcoming place for children. And I remember we used to beg my mother to drive us to the playground because it was so far away, we'd have to drive to a playground. Even my school, which was right up the street, my segregated Black school, I still have scars that I usually cover over with a little bit of makeup from all the times I fell on concrete when I was playing at the school playground, because that's all there was. So I say that because, you know, in my neighborhood, not only was that our reality, there were all kinds of things that explained why. We also have far too many parents not able to buy healthy food. Or we had my best friend's mom, my best friend Shoreline's mom, worked at the neighborhood grocery store, and yet when the landlord increased her rent because she didn't earn enough money, they were displaced. And one of the reasons all that displacement started was the public transit started to come to DC, except it actually jacked up the rents where we rented, and Black communities had to fight to get more subway line opened to Black parts of the city. And that formed me, that shaped me, and it's a big reason why I went to law school, to be a civil rights attorney, I won't talk about the resume from there, but I will talk a little bit about the Center for Social Inclusion. Because one of the things we did there when we founded it was, and I founded it with a colleague in front of mine, it was when September 11th happened. And when September 11th happened, you know, one of the things that we saw all the time happened, which was federal dollars coming into the city to help recover us, which we desperately needed as a city, except that it was the Lower East Side and Chinatown were cut out of the catchment area for the $21 billion in investments. Not to mention the fact that the entire city was reeling. And folks were coming there from employment from all over the city and the region. But I say that because we founded the center as a place where we would bring fortunately, our experience in research and policy advocacy to partner with communities of color and national organizations on dismantling structural racism. And one of the things that brought us to, and one of the techniques we use is we didn't just come into community and tell them what they needed. We would come in and talk about the problems and what structurally would create more opportunity. And we got engaged and we created a project called Energy Democracy at the center. And the reason we did was because we had Black homeowners and landowners, low income in South Carolina say, look, there's all this talk about green jobs, but we have this asset. We may be low income, but we have an asset. It's called land. So why can't we be generators in a renewable energy context? Not just looking to try to find green jobs, which, you know, we're far and few between in South Carolina, I can tell you that. But I'm just saying that to say, then we realized there were not enough resources and there was not enough partnership with all the various skills you had and knowledge and policies you had to bring together to help communities of color think about how they could become generators in energy democracy. And so, you know, we partnered and worked with folks on that. We weren't the experts, and that wasn't the point. The point was to solve problems collectively and bring what we all had to the table. And I brought that into city government with me when de Blasio became mayor and asked me to be his counsel. And, you know, one of the things that was so gratifying about it was I went in because I didn't know him, but I did believe that government, particularly local government, could be more transformational and could see our problems as linked so that we would start creating solutions that were linked. And I talk about more of that, I'm sure, in the question and answers. But to me, that was clearly possible, and I was fortunate to get to demonstrate that in the context of broadband, which I started working on at the Center for Social Inclusion because as we were doing energy democracy, it became very clear that one of the investments communities of color didn't have was, frankly, investments in broadband access, which was an infrastructure requirement for so many of the innovations that we could do around energy and around, you know, what it meant to do economic development. So I was able to find the revenue and show the city how it could do something it never thought about doing before, which was provide free broadband to every single apartment in Queensbridge houses. Now, I also saw how it fails, and I think we'll talk some about that, which includes a vision of leadership, but leadership that listens, that learns, and then that partners in its leadership and decision making. And I say that because, as we know, this city has made so much progress in some important ways on establishing standards and goals for a more sustainable city, as has the state. In some instances, groundbreaking, historic, and more than others have done. And what's so critical now is the implementation. And the implementation that recognizes it has to be about all of us. Because the other thing that really calls me in is the thing I love about this city, which is that everyone is here. We have everyone. We have 800 languages. We had folks born in 40% of our people foreign born somewhere else. We have descendants of North American slaves and the largest Native American indigenous population in the country, urban population in the country. And yet a lot of that is at risk. And we have to be a place where we can all live with dignity. And that's no matter what we look like, no matter what part of the city we live in, no matter how much we earn, big bank account, no bank account at all. This is part of what makes us the vibrant city that we are. And we have to make all of that sustainable. And yes, that means we have to confront our most pressing problems. And that includes climate, and climate in a context that still has deep racial inequity, and in a context where our survival is about our ability to partner and come together and solve our problems. And that's why I'm running for mayor. And that's why I look forward to having more discussion with you, including the problem solving. So I'll stop there.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think that was an excellent entree. And boy, that broadband for all seems really prescient right now, for particularly those parents who are trying to figure out how to educate their children from home. So as you alluded to, we have a number of questions. So the first one we really do want to talk about is the climate plan that you sort of alluded to, right? So scientists are telling us we have to take real actions to reduce emissions over the next 10 years to avoid the worst impacts of the climate crisis. And both the previous and the current mayor have laid out their plans to combat climate change. But frankly, over the last 7 years, we're now at best even with where we were when we started, for a whole variety of reasons. But if elected, what will your plan look like, and how will you ensure that we have real measurable progress to reduce emissions? And as you alluded to, how would your climate policy prioritize communities that have been overburdened by pollution?
Thank you for that question. So listen, we know that there are 3 big categories, right, for our carbon emissions, for our greenhouse gas emissions, and that's buildings, that's transportation, and it's waste. And so the plan has to incorporate those 3 things, but I think it has to incorporate those 3 things in several different ways. So, one that's obvious and necessary is, Climate Mobilization Act is a big deal. And I think it's incredibly important. And I know folks on this Zoom, and Peggy, big shout out to you, helping to get, an implementation plan that would actually, meaning documentation of how we're doing, transparency, tracking. Those things are critically important, because if we're not being very clear, not just about where we want to be in 2030 or 2050, but what the measurable benchmarks are, tracking them, making them public, and having leadership that both pulls city together to be effective at implementing and partnering in that implementation, and enforcing where enforcement is necessary. A big part of that is management of city government, and it does require a mayor to manage that, to hold that accountability, hold the vision, create the benchmarks, and ensure the accountability, but also to partner. Because as we know on the other things, like transportation, for example, critically important, we're going to need partnership with the federal government as well as the state, both to think about how we're going to have real transit investments. That's going to be critical, but also in a way that ensures we're investing in our transit deserts. Because we know some of the same communities that have the greatest environmental insults, some of the same communities that have the worst environmental health, are the same communities that don't have equal access to bike lanes or to public transit and buses. And we have to fix that. But because we also need a transportation system that is sustainable in terms of how we get where we need to go, that all our people can get there, but do in a way that cleans the fleet. And we have to get back to compostables. I grew up in a house where my mother was a serious composter, and she actually turned our driveway in our house, which, it was like a dirt driveway, and she turned it into a vegetable garden. And we got our vegetables and fruits out of our vegetable garden from the compost that we generated, and we lived in the city. But there's a way for the city to do that, despite our budget woes, that really works, and again, in partnership, because in all of these areas, we have the opportunity to think about our partnerships for community-based, neighborhood-based innovation. And I don't think we should lose sight of that, particularly when we are in budget troubles. And we do have budget trouble. Well, we have a revenue crisis because of COVID that has also then produced an expense crisis. But again, our partnerships with federal government, with state for the infrastructure investments we need, but also to look at how we leverage better the assets and resources we have in government, like our capital construction budget, to partner with communities with the resources that we have and can raise effectively to solve the problems community by community, because we do have innovators. We do have innovative ideas, and we do have some solutions that are going to look different one neighborhood to the next to accomplish what we want to accomplish that brings dignity to all of us. And so that's the way I lead. Listen, learn, and lead in partnership. And that's the way we'll develop a plan and implement it.
I did write those 3 words down earlier. I knew we were going to be hearing them again. So speaking of transportation, because that is a huge issue, you know, congestion has been a big issue, in particular in the business district here in Manhattan. The pandemic, we've seen a decline in transit ridership, hasn't bounced back yet. We're not sure when that's going to happen. Hopefully, as the vaccine starts rolling out and people start moving back, that will be helpful. But we're also seeing an increase in single occupancy vehicles. And while congestion pricing, when enacted, may ease congestion a bit, there's more that the city can do without getting permission from Albany or the federal government, which we know is why we were delayed so long on congestion pricing. What's your vision? And you started alluding to some things with referencing transit desert, which always is music to all of our ears. What do you envision for moving people around more and making the best of our streets?
Yeah, when I was at the Center for Social Inclusion, one of the central planks that we also work on is equity. And a thing that happens that we saw happen in COVID that will help move us down this path, even I think a little bit more quickly, because we should recognize that COVID has created some opportunity for change, even while it's created some challenges, is open streets. Mm-hmm. And, you know, as we saw as folks, you know, were starved this summer for the opportunity to be in community, the desperate need to get out of doors because, you know, so many of our residents are in overcrowded or small apartments, right? And also reconnect with one another, but in a way that made us safe. And as we saw corridors, and, you know, these corridors are also from Mott Haven in the South Bronx to my own neighborhood in Central Brooklyn, you know, seeing our restaurants and our businesses kind of pour out onto the streets, taking some of the streets back, including the streets around, you know, Prospect Park, which is a park I get to utilize, and I'm grateful to utilize, that those things were really transformative for so many people, and people loved it. And people loved it in communities all over the city, but not all communities have them. So there's both creating more permanency around them as a way to live, as a way to plan, but also to do community planning, neighborhood planning that finds the opportunities to do more of that, and do more of that based on the neighborhood, the shape of the neighborhood, where the businesses are, and how that can grow open streets in a way that serves the small business and help us bring small businesses back, serve the community by creating community spaces and spaces for community gathering. I mean, also help us, you know, we have to link the public transit to those opportunities so that we're also creating the incentives to get more people out of cars. And one thing that we've been talking about, and I don't have a plan on this, but these are the kinds of things I think we have to be willing to innovate, is looking at how technology and on-demand can be more democratized so that it's better jobs for folks, but also that start to serve needs in new and interesting ways. But I'm also, when we were at the Center for Social Inclusion, one of the things we complained about loudly during the Great Recession in terms of stimulating new opportunities, including in New York City, was more bus rapid transit lines. We wanted them in 2008 when I was running the Center for Social Inclusion. Gratified to see more of them in this city. We have more opportunities to do that both opens up, you know, our streets, makes them safer for our people, and we do need bike lanes in all boroughs. And when I've been talking to folks in the South Bronx wants bike lanes. South Bronx deserves bike lanes.
Agreed. We probably have some work to do in the Bronx on getting more people around how bikes can be democratized and helpful, but yes, for sure. So speaking about bus rapid transit, you know, we have all these bus depots and airports and highway interchanges and other forms of infrastructure, you know, that are systematically built to burden low-income neighborhoods. How would you reduce emissions from our transportation infrastructure on those frontline communities?
Yeah, and I want to really both partner with communities on the solutions. I know community-based organizations and also the Alliance, like like NEJA have been real leaders in thinking about this. Things like, commercial waste zones. I think that has been an innovation and something that we should look at building upon, but also looking at where and how it's happening so that we're responding to community about how to do that in a holistic way that meets the health needs, but also making sure that the way we're doing that is meeting other needs. Because I think so often, like as we just said in South Bronx, where there's a real need for more public transit and for multiple kinds, as well as all the environmental insults that we think about. How do we do that in a way that recognizes it's also about growing the whole community? So we do have to be better as a city at doing community level planning, at engaging residents, because sometimes the opposition is about the failure of opportunity for folks to participate in charting the future of their communities, and also to take into account how we do it in ways that don't just burden another burdened community, because we do want lasting solutions. We do want solutions that we can build upon. We don't just want a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. We want real transformation. So I do think that requires partnering. I do think that requires much more than we have traditionally done in the city, and that's a real opportunity. And in part, we want to make sure it's responsive and that it's smart.
So you mentioned you frequent Prospect Park. Although city parks make up 14% of New York City's land, City Parks Department only gets about 0.6% of the city's budget. In 2019, the League, along with our friends at New Yorkers for Parks and DC 37, founded the Playfair for Parks campaign to call for investments in capital projects and maintenance of our parks and open spaces, which we know during this year in particular, parks have been one of the few sanctuaries that New Yorkers could take advantage of when many of our cultural institutions were closed. So parks and other natural areas provide not just critical recreation opportunities, but also serve as environmental infrastructure, providing, cleaning the air, absorbing carbon and air pollution, and stormwater. Please describe your commitment to funding for parks and open space and how you will ensure that investments are made in communities. Unlike mine, I'm very fortunate. I live in a park, I'm in park luxury here. Central Park, Riverside Park, Hudson River Park. There are far too many communities that don't have anywhere near that kind of park access. So how will you make sure that those communities have access to parks?
Yeah, and our parks were lifesavers, and this is a really big problem. We were supposed to have, more park equity. So one of the things we have to do is look, we have a capital construction budget. We should, that can be smart borrowing, because that's what capital construction budget is. We have to look at it in a way that brings us back, but brings us back fairly. Thing about my park, and it wasn't just my park, we actually have a greenway in my neighborhood. It used to be the trolley tracks that got turned into essentially these little islands, right? That served as park. And frankly, it is park. The neighborhood association also pays for some of its upkeep, but it is public. It's public space, and it became more space for folks in apartment buildings to use. And the thing that is amazing about it is it's also community. I mean, it brought us all closer together. It made us all feel better, and like there was still life. And this whole sense that New York was dying was not true. I mean, we were in bad times, but it was in neighborhoods that you saw the life of New York City, even while the life in Midtown had been stripped from it. So some aspects of this is about using the opportunity for this planning and for looking at our capital construction smartly to build out whole communities and doing it in holistic ways. And I'll just give one crazy example. But we have this we don't need it in my neighborhood either, but it's an example of opportunity where we have this little square, right? And it's right by the subway station. It's right at a place where community can now gather, because folks decided we could utilize the space and put tables out there, but it's concrete. There's no reason it couldn't be grassland, because as I said, where we've seen these patches of green, people utilized them during COVID, and we can create more green space in a lot of unique and interesting ways when we allow the community to find its opportunity to plan its green space, because communities do want it, and it is a way to build community as well as health, as well as environmental sustainability. And that's the way I would look at it in my administration.
Great. So you mentioned commercial waste zones. Garbage is one of the most visible way of life issues that New Yorkers all unite around. No one wants to see the garbage piling up on our streets or in our parks. Waste comprises 2.5% of the greenhouse gas emissions, and almost 90% of that comes from landfills. So One NYC calls for reducing the amount of waste going to landfills 100% by 2030. What will you do to reduce the amount of waste that is wasted by going to landfills? And you already mentioned the organic waste collection program, which has been cut back to a skeleton of what it was, including there's a hearing on Friday to talk about what limited composting there is potentially being dislocated from the current location. What are you going to do to make sure that New Yorkers don't lose this habit of recycling their food and yard scraps? I was especially heartened by your personal story. I have a composter at my house in Albany where I used to live, and my tenants still use it, but it's great. It's how easy it is to do when people know what you can do. So those are sort of the two things I'm looking for.
Well, look, we have to figure out a way to get back to compostables. We just have to. But I think even in the short run, even recognizing the crisis, it's how we look at the opportunities of community organizing around this. In many communities, it's already happening. We also have our urban garden movement, and we've got that in a lot of communities where that's a real part of how community organizes its open space for itself and utilizes it, maintains it, but also does a lot of education around it. And I think there's a real opportunity, even in a tight budget, to have a moral budget that serves our recovery in a way that reimagines. And one of it is to seed, we do have to do more public education, and we just have to figure out a way to get back there. But we can also do it in a way that builds up the neighborhood solutions that neighborhoods themselves have been innovating, and also utilize that to think about how we spread those innovations to other neighborhoods, help share and create sharing and learning communities on strategies for this. We saw it with farmers markets, right? As we've seen farmers markets proliferate around the city, including in some low-income communities that are food deserts. And so and one of the things that happened in our neighborhood farmers market, and we are an income integrated, we have a lot of different income levels. In my neighborhood was part of the farmers market did public education around composting and showed how you could even compost in an apartment. And we have to create sites where we're enabling people to come use or dump their compost. So I think there's several strategies. I don't pretend to have all the answers. And one of the things that we're doing as a campaign is having people's assemblies, as well as talking to folks who are doing the work and innovating in community and who are experts, so that there's more collective thinking about the innovation that's already happening and how we build from it. Because I think that one of the most amazing things about this city, and there's so many amazing things about this city, but it is that, New Yorkers figure it out, and New Yorkers get unified around problems and figure out how to solve them. And when city government participates as a partner in that, celebrates it, lifts it up, figures out how to align city resources or what the city does around it, we can actually leverage so much more, even in a time when we have belt tightening. And that's the way I would approach that.
Great. Superstorm Sandy showed that much of New York City needs to adapt to protect our communities, our infrastructure, and lives. Yet 8 years later, we're still vulnerable to sea level rise and storm surge. Cities and dense communities are also at risk of heat impacts, including the urban heat island effect. Low-income people are especially vulnerable with less access to air conditioning and cooling centers, which, as Peggy will say, requires you to go out in the hot and walk there. How will your administration act to make the shoreline in our communities more resilient to the impacts of climate change?
Well, look, this has to be critical, and we have to recognize that it also has to include low-income communities of color that are impacted by this. That was one of the challenges that we saw around Hurricane Sandy, was also the focus, and the city being able to keep up and implement those strategies well. So I think there are multiple things that we have to do, and it does start with also more advocacy from the federal government to meet some of our global, now that we know this administration is going to come back to the Paris Accord, that it has to be part of how we think about our infrastructure and what's going to happen with the federal infrastructure bill, and how we're utilizing, green infrastructure and green infrastructure investments. And again, I would leverage capital construction, talk about state programs, and what's coming out of the federal government to think about this. But I also want to make sure, because I'm very aware, as I know all of you are, and probably more knowledgeable about this than I am, that it's not just the 100-year flood zone. And this is a real issue, right? As we know from private research, we are at substantially more risk to flooding, including from rainfall, than that gives us. So we need to think about resiliency as well in a deeper and more expansive way while we think about our shoreline. So again, I would look at that with experts. We know that there are a number of things under discussion and some projects underway, but we have to make sure that we are doing it in a way that, in addition to making us more resilient, is making our families and our communities more resilient. Because as we know, because the economic justice movement has been clear and is absolutely right about this, we don't really have resiliency in the absence of connecting people to the job opportunities, to the generating opportunities, so that they can not only sustain their families, they are innovators in the solutions. And so that's a very, very central principle from my perspective on resiliency, is making sure it's inclusive and that all the benefits that come with those investments are inclusive of the people who need them the most.
Well, that's an excellent lead in to my next question, which is about environmental justice, because we have too often communities of color and low-income neighborhoods have been burdened by years of environmental racism and pollution, from the dirty bus depots to the stacks emitting toxins to housing with lead, paint, and molds, which contribute to chronic illnesses like asthma, greater risk of cancer, and stunted growth and learning. And of course, as you've noted, the risk to having damage from flooding. How will we rectify past decisions and ensure that future policies enacted by your administration don't disproportionately impact these communities with negative environmental impacts, or more proactively, as you're suggesting, the inclusiveness in making the communities resilient while we're making the neighborhood physically resilient?
Yeah, so part of that is real planning and support for planning in low-income communities of color, who are often burdened because they're low-income communities of color, as we know. And I'll just cite the research of Manuel Pastor that shows the insults come to communities of color. It's not that people just go to the insults, the environmental insults. And that's important to understand, because the decision-making has to be, the communities get to plan for themselves, but also that no community gets to say, not in my backyard. And that's actually really important also as we grapple with climate change, because when any community can pass off its fair share of the burden of environmental degradation, it can also ignore and avoid just how much behavior change we need to make in the society. And behavior change is tough, right? That's one of the reasons why we're struggling now to reduce our carbon emissions. And one of the things that we have to do is say, you generate it, you do have to own it too. So fair share is a really important, we all have to both benefit collectively from what we're able to produce that's positive in society, and we have to share equitably in the burdens that society sometimes brings. And that kind of framework includes all the things we're talking about. So when we're talking about development and growth, it has to benefit everyone, right? It can't, and when we're talking about managing problems and solutions to those problems, we also have to talk about burden sharing. And I do think that's critical also to making behavior change. So that's the approach that we would use. And I realize I didn't answer your cooling center question, but the community conditions that have to recognize that communities have different needs and priorities in terms of how they have to manage resilience in the context of climate change is a framework that then ensures that the city, and the way that I would organize the resources of the city and government responses, is that it takes into account the special needs of different communities. because it isn't a one size fits all. And the cooling center example is an example of that, where not all communities, not all neighbors, not all blocks need it. And so where and how we identify and create the solutions for those who do is a big part of the lens that government has to have and has to use.
Great, thank you. So New York City, like many older cities, has struggled to eradicate lead poisoning. We saw some really bad news about this last week with NYCHA in particular, and there's been chronic lack of enforcement by HPD of existing laws, with fewer cases being brought or detected during the pandemic because of suspended inspections and delayed pediatric well visits, where kids are screened and public health professionals are concerned about an uptick in childhood blood lead level cases. What would you do to make sure exposure to this environmental toxin is once and for all eliminated?
You know, a very close friend of my daughter who grew up in public housing, she and her siblings were lead paint poisoned in public housing. That young woman is amazing. She's on a full ride scholarship to University of Virginia right now, having graduated a couple years ago. She's doing extremely well. She's an amazing human, and it's an incredible story. But she did it on her own. She did it by herself. And not all kids can do that, but also the fact that she suffered, the fact that she still suffers, that she manages it, and it's amazing to watch, but she will always carry it with her, is unforgivable. It's unforgivable. And I think of all the kids who don't. So let's just start with the fact that there has to be accountability to the residents of NYCHA. And we have to have a plan that is transparent to residents and engage them in a way that enables them to see the data, understand the plan, and weigh in and change it if necessary. That is critical. And lots of problems around NYCHA, as we know, with investments also around its energy efficiency, around folks just getting heat in the winter because of the old boilers. And we know they're not energy efficient. When we did Queensbridge houses, one of the opportunities that created of putting in that free broadband was also in thinking about how NYCHA could have more smart metering and understand better what its waste was in that building. I don't know whether that's happened because I left city government before that, but you know, that kind of management and creating more governance opportunities for residents to manage that, to track it, both from lead paint abatement, but also from an energy efficiency standpoint, and be able to have some say in the use of the funds for the savings, you know, is something that we have to think and talk actively about with residents. But in terms of some things are simple, you know. There was a report out, I think it was a couple of years ago, I can't remember the exact date, so don't hold me to it. But, you know, it was government just in doing its, you know, contacting people about lead during the day when folks were at work, rather than changing its schedule so that it was doing it at night when folks were home. Was just like, it was one of those simple things that government just had to reorient how it thinks about and deploys its services and its enforcement. In this case, it was services and identifying and testing homes. So there are all kinds of ways in which some of it is simple, and government just changing what it's doing in a way that is more reflective of how people live their lives and less reflective about how government is just used to doing things. And the other is to just be much more transparent and allow resident governance. But it is something that the city has to be accountable for, and it has to be job one, because our kids don't recover from lead paint poisoning.
No, that's well taken. And it is amazing how oftentimes it is those little simple things that can make a big difference that don't necessarily cost a lot of money, although in that case probably would require a union rule, but,
But it's cool.
No, for sure, it is. It's not that complicated, especially if you engage people. Sometimes those simple things do make the biggest differences. So the last sort of question I have before I kick it over to a few lightning rounds and then the audience, you know, is, and we've alluded to this already, is, you know, we have climate change and environmental protection is not only good for the environment, but it could generate tens of thousands of family sustaining jobs. what will you do to bolster green jobs? And how would your green jobs prioritize a just transition to a green energy economy? And I know you've already talked about that a little bit, but if there's a way to sort of encapsulate that in one place here.
Yeah, so first of all, think about stimulate. Look, it's economy. We have to recover it. We have to come back from COVID, but we have to do it in a reimagined way. It can't just be going back to where we were before COVID struck. So that includes in terms of our environmental sustainability, in terms of our environmental justice, in terms of our, overall, having communities and people who have dignity. So some of that is looking at our capital construction budget, looking at how we create more green infrastructure, but looking at how we align those opportunities with the other things that city does. So for example, we have workforce development programs in several agencies of city government, several agencies, but they're pretty siloed. We don't actually kind of think about them more as a collective resource, a partner in a way. We do partnerships, but again, they can be quite siloed, but partner in a way that recognizes where those job opportunities are going so that we're aligning those opportunities with our workforce dollars. That we're also looking at that from an educational standpoint, including K through 12 and into our incredible public resource that is CUNY, in thinking about where those job opportunities are and how we start preparing kids. My kids, my brother, since we have a Dan Wiley fan, one of the things he did before he went to work for a congresswoman, and he did this as an artist who is very engaged in community and in public space, but he created school programs for kids on environmental science and the built environment. And he did that for elementary school. And they were amazing programs. I used to make him, do a little sideshow with my kids so that they could get a real sense of their city, how it was built. They would go do water testing, in the Gowanus Canal. So I'm saying this because, this really has to be inculcated into all kinds of different things that we do in city government, because we do so many different things, but have them be more strategically aligned and pipelined. And also the communities identified that need to be our communities of concern, so that we are creating and generating those opportunities that link both to resiliency, but also the job opportunities that come with it, as well as what the opportunities are to be more innovative and to be more generative, right? Because our communities have the ability to be quite innovative and generative as well. So I would take those kinds of resources in city government and be smarter about their de-siloing and their utilization and their partnering.
Great. Always good to use by leading by example, right? All right. A few quick lightning rounds, since you already talked about composting in a park. I will skip those, but do you bike?
I used to bike. I used to bike to Center for Social Inclusion from Central Brooklyn on the bike lanes and over the Brooklyn Bridge. Down Broadway, because I used to work downtown. Now I stopped when I stopped when I started working at the new school, because I couldn't figure out where and how to shower.
That's fair. That's totally fair. How often do you take mass transit? And that can be the subway, the bus, the train, even a ferry.
I take it regularly. I've always taken it to work, except for those times when I was biking or periodically when I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office. I had a friend, we used to, a couple days a week, we would run home together. That's our way to get our exercise. But public transit has always been central to my life in New York City. I've also been very fortunate because we do live in a transit-rich neighborhood, and that has enabled us to be reliant on it, and we are.
Okay. Since you already told us you have gobs and gobs of reusable bags, I will skip that one.
I have some samples if you want to.
Have you ever driven an electric car?
I have not.
Okay, well, we'll get you out on a test ride.
Okay, I would love that.
Steve, would you like to start us off with the questions from the audience?
First, I want to see Maya's reusable bag collection. You can tell a lot about people from there.
Just to be clear, Joe, I don't know if everybody saw this. She also had a cat, so I think Angela is really sad that she's not here anymore, because I saw the cat in the background at one point. Trying to see
This is only one
Nice.
You gotta lift it up. Don't let, I can't get the whole, wait, raise it up a little bit. I couldn't see the whole thing. Ah, okay, good. Don't let media down. I like that.
We have canvas, tons of canvas, which is actually my favorite because I find
That's
it
nice.
very. But we also recycle, like our food co-op. We have a bunch of those bags, and we use those as well.
Yeah, my wife likes the canvas ones too. They're high production bags.